The Nintendo 64 is not a console often associated with role-playing games, and for good reason. With a total of 4 titles that actually call RPGs, and a hobbit's handful of other entries which share common elements of the genre, there's anything but a healthy selection. So, as a tribute to the genre I hold dear, I've decided to make a clickbaity as fuck 4-part series documenting each of these titles, in which I will attempt to say something meaningful about every Nintendo 64 RPG ever, for whatever the fuck that's worth. As this is the first part, I figure I'd start with the most recognizable and arguably the most traditional RPG on the system, Paper Mario. If you've never played this brilliant game, it features flat papercraft sprites existing within a 3D world, and the level of charm is insane. While it is a simplistic, traditional turn-based affair, it does separate itself from the rabble with timed commands and probably some other shit we'll talk about later. What I've always loved about Paper Mario was how it expanded the Mushroom Kingdom by introducing formerly antagonistic creatures as non-hostile civilized characters and stuck them in mundane day-to-day roles. I always saw this as a humanizing factor, which showed how there's this huge world outside of the eternal struggle between Mario and Bowser, and how it's been largely neglected until this point. A diverse set of sprites goes a long way in assisting this expansion, and the game certainly isn't shy about it. The opening scene has you moving about Peach's castle, interacting with a slew of unique characters from all varied locations of the world. After this, you find yourself in a small Goomba village on the outskirts of a bustling town, and each sprite has its own distinct characteristic, differentiating them from one another. This is quite the harsh turn from Mario of old, where Nintendo weren't afraid to call a turtle and be done with it. It'd be ridiculous to expect every character to have that level of attention and detail, so the few areas with commonly repeating sprites are more than forgivable, especially when coupled with the amazing dialogue. It is particularly noticeable in some areas, such as Koopa Town, where 90% of the population is the same guy, but it's far from a big issue. I find that my attention is drawn more toward the world itself than the characters anyway. The areas have such a grand feeling to them, despite being quite limited and restrictive, and I hate to overhype anything, but the scope of the world left me awestruck. I think it had to do with how far away the background seemed relative to the foreground. While the foreground maps get the job done, nothing quite entrances you like your own imagination, and whenever seeing crude 3D models slapped atop a distant shot of a thick forest, an endless desert, or green pixelated polyhedrons, my imagination kicked into overdrive. I know they're simply static images put in place to make the world seem less empty, so I'd say they work to an extreme degree, but the profound effect they had on me is likely not one shared with too many people. However, I would love to be wrong about that. A slightly less personal element of the world that I thought was well designed was the centralized hub. All of the major locations you'll venture to on your quest are connected to the central hub in one way or another, most of which you'll have to physically move to, which I much prefer to, say, warp pipes, because it feels like you're exploring a world rather than being transported to an objective. Each chunk of the game is split into chapters with a self-contained sequence of events occurring in that location, and the bite-sized approach to story, especially in an RPG, feels incredibly refreshing. After your mini-adventures in each area end, you'll find yourself back in the central hub town, and it feels so safe and comforting, yet things are constantly changing. NPCs have ever-shifting dialogue, and characters make personal progress with their own unimportant lives, and it comes off as though it exists independent of whatever the player's doing, further bolstering the world building. I also love how events aren't given any major context. You simply walk into a town and there's a bunch of black toads, or a bunch of shy guys stealing shit from the townsfolk. Your interaction with the world is what gives you context, and ultimately a resolution, versus having the narrative explained to you in intrusive ways. And that's not to say Paper Mario isn't intrusive, as you don't even get timed commands until after you've been through enough battles to make even the most dedicated Nintendrone weep. However, most of the tutorials are skippable, which is a very odd feature for a Nintendo game, and almost makes up for the heavy-handed approach Paper Mario takes to guidance. To say you're force-fed enough hints to make a Deep Throat Queen gag would be to understate the situation. The world's designed around partner abilities, and having a firm grasp of what they are and how they work is often required to make progress as well as to locate secrets. Once the game has explained how to use a partner, that should be the end of it, unless you actively seek out that information for yourself. Where Paper Mario falters is that it sets up plenty of scenarios which aren't immediately apparent to the player, and then reminds you of an ability you have which happens to be the solution. While my memory is trash and I can barely remember what I had for breakfast, I walk away from situations like this feeling insulted. Taking accessibility to extremes can ruin a game just as much as the opposite scenario, where you have no idea how things work or how to progress. One example of this, which pissed me off to no end, was in a section in Chapter 3 shortly after you're given a party member who can turn Mario invisible as long as he doesn't move. You're introduced to a room with 4 hovering drone-looking things, which seek Mario, grab him, and eject him from the premise. To understand how to bypass the guards, your first interaction should be to activate their AI and watch how they behave. Once you understand that they lock onto Mario when he's in their sphere of influence, you'll naturally test your partner's ability, and sure enough, that's the solution. It's not a complex puzzle by any means, and hell, I'd barely call it a puzzle, but it's still teaching the player how to use their abilities in interesting ways. If the event took place like that, with no hints or external input, it'd be an amazing example of teaching the player without assuming they were a fucking invalid. However, just as you waltz your fat Italian sausage into the room, you're reminded of that ability you gained not 10 minutes ago. It's defeating to see such potential get thrown out the window, but such is Nintendo. So far, I've really only focused on the world of Paper Mario, which is intentional because I believe it to be the best part of the game. The story's fairly bare bones, and outside of a few interesting character interactions, it's really nothing to write home about. I think the best thing I could say about it is that it gets the job done and attempts to keep things feeling fresh without venturing too far outside its comfort zone. Due to the chapter-based approach, which filters content into bite-sized chunks, I never felt like it dragged or overstayed its welcome, and that's all a story really needs for me to enjoy it. On top of that, all the backstory is presented in a pre-title screen cutscene. I think most people would have skipped this without having realized that it was actually context for the following events, but I like that the opening to the story begins from Mario's perspective and doesn't require that the stage be set. I think this showcases the advantages of simplistic stories, where not all elements need be present or explained, and that leaving some detail to the imagination can add to an experience. As I mentioned before, each chapter is a self-contained mystery of sorts, where you're given a brief goal and then the miniature narratives begin to unfold within themselves. I'd say my biggest gripe with this is that the quality of each chapter varies heavily, with the earlier and later chapters being the most gripping and featuring the best forward motion. Chapters 4, 5, and 6, or the middle chapters, are little more than tedious busy work. Fetch quests litter these, and a constant back and forth screams that they were desperate to pad the game at the expense of fun. Mid-game gloom isn't a foreign thing for video games, but some of these chapters are absolutely terrible with how much fetching you're required to do. Chapter 4 is particularly bad for this, where you're forced to go into a toy box in town and then constantly leave it to incrementally enable more progress within the stage. It's only a short jaunt outside the box, but the death of the forward motion doesn't help keep you invested, and the contents inside the box aren't exactly gripping either. Now that I've bitched and moaned about a whole host of shit, let's talk about the meat of the game, the combat. When you're not running errands for the middle chunk of the game, you'll likely be engaged in combat, and it's combat. It's more or less the standard affair, where Mario and his partner take a turn, then if the enemy's still alive, they get a turn too. You can time a button press as you attack for extra damage and as you defend for less damage. It's nothing mind-blowing, even for the time. What I do love about it is how every enemy has its own unique attack patterns. Oftentimes, each monster will have 2 or 3 different attacks, and learning the timing for each is a trial and error effort. It can be dangerous to take every attack without blocking, especially when it comes to boss fights, so observation and timing are key in otherwise stock JRPG battles. While it's far from difficult, it's certainly engaging. I don't require my games be overly hard as long as they're fun, and the combat in Paper Mario is all that and more. The partners are low liability as they don't have a health bar, and if they're attacked, they're typically stunned for a handful of turns. This rarely happens, but when it does, you really feel it. It's incredibly easy to switch between partners, both in and out of battle, and this keeps it feeling fresh as each has their own strengths and weaknesses. A few partners are weak to spiked enemies, and some are unable to hit flying enemies at all, and the game dictates that you have to rotate your roster frequently. This adds to the elements of preparation, which isn't necessary, but it certainly helps. Upon defeat, enemies yield star points, which is the Mario equivalent of experience. Get 100 of these and you level up. I'm sure you've played an RPG before. I've always found the level up system interesting, as you're prompted to select one of the 3 core stats to increase. There's HP, which is self-explanatory, FP, which is effectively MP, and badge points, which allow you to equip new abilities. This system always scared me, as I was never good with dividing up gains and didn't want to screw myself in the late game, but this seems almost impossible as each stat has a cap and can be easily maxed out by the final chapter. I quite like the potential of it in the early parts of the game, as it works more as a difficulty modifier than anything. Increasing your HP means your survivability goes up, more FP means you can output damage faster and more consistently, and badge points give you early access to a vaster range of abilities and attacks. There's quite a bit of potential for it to be something really special, but in its current form, it's just an occasional reward making the game marginally easier. It would have been nice had the system incentivized weird builds, but at the risk of alienating people, I understand why the safest route was clearly opted for. The last thing I want to address is that Paper Mario finally answers the question of what happens to Peach after Bowser kidnaps her. While the more adventurous of us would jump to the conclusion that Bowser's enjoying a fine Peach dish, it's quite the opposite in fact. Turns out, in Paper Mario at least, Peach was playing housewife for a twink. Unfortunate names aside, I actually hate the Peach sections. They're very rarely interesting and never give me any information I couldn't have figured out for myself. There is one part where Kammy Koopa asks the Pink Princess what Mario hates, and you have the option to select a bunch of items which will benefit you on your journey. Honestly, that scene's probably one of my favorites from the game, but other than that, it's really bland, and the shit they make you do is fucking mind-numbing. This actually got fixed in the next game, but that's the topic for a future video. So that's Paper Mario. It's a lovely, humble little game that often gets pushed to the side in favour of its slightly more refined sequel, The Thousand Year Door. Granted, the GameCube entry is one of the greatest RPG experiences you'll ever have, but the original is still a fantastic game and significantly better than any of the post-GameCube titles. Next time on every Nintendo 64 RPG ever, please click my channel, I like ad revenue. I'll be taking a look at a game you probably haven't played and may not have even heard of. I'm looking forward to playing it, and I hope you'll join me. I've been Caspasaurus. Thanks for watching.